Welcome back to Theolife with Professor Patrick Stitt as we're continuing on our study of the general epistles. Next, we are digging into the epistle of Hebrews. Now, in our last lesson, we talked a lot about the historical background and all the things that were happening in the world at that time to create the situation that led to the book of Hebrews being written. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the content of what was happening in the world at that time. There were three issues that were happening in the church at that time that were creating the controversy that led to the writing of the book. Those issues were political, theological, and spiritual. Let's start with political.
Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, the Emperor Claudius, expelled them from Rome.
From this, we can decipher that the Jews were being persecuted in Rome because of their faith in Chrestus, who was likely Christ. Now, I want to break that down a little bit more. In those days, Christianity was seen as a Jewish sect. So when people wanted to persecute Christians, they ended up persecuting all Jews because they didn't think there was a difference between Jews and Christians. In the Roman Empire, the Jews were actually given a great amount of tolerance by a lot of Roman emperors, particularly people like Augustus, who was very, very close with Herod. But now all of a sudden, these Jewish Christians living in Rome came under intense persecution because they were Christians. If you can imagine, that's got to lead to a bit of a mental stress.
I was being a good Jew, minding my own business, and I didn't have any problems. Now, I've converted to Christianity, I'm getting kicked out of my house, my family's getting persecuted, I'm losing my business, I'm losing my livelihood.
It would be very normal for any person to think, well, why don't I just go back to being a Jew and then I won't be persecuted anymore? This is how the beginning of the issue was political. The second issue is, of course, theological. As these Jewish Christians are processing their political situation, they're starting to imagine,
well, could I just go back to being a really good, extra super duper Jew and do all of the wonderful Jewish things that I did before and still be okay with God? I mean, hey, he was cool with us being Jews for like 3,000 years, and Jesus only showed up a couple of decades ago. Can we just keep going back to being Jews?
Now the issue becomes spiritual. Because faced with the worldly persecution and the theological considerations of their salvation, this community was going back to its Jewish roots and abandoning its Christian identity to have greater theological and political conformity with the world. This created a Christian community that was basically abandoning its Christianness in order to go back to a more socially, politically acceptable theology and political standing. The content of Hebrews is fundamentally addressing this issue. The author is arguing that Christ is superior to all your old ways of life. In chapter 1, the author argues for the superiority of angels. In chapter 2, the author argues Christ is superior to Moses. In chapter 4, the author argues Christ is superior to the land of Israel. In chapter 5, the author argues that Christ is superior to the high priest. In chapter 6, the author argues for the superiority of Abraham. In chapter 9, the author argues for the superiority of the temple. Now, what you should notice about that is the author is addressing chapter by chapter the cultural, theological, and religious strongholds of the Jewish identity. If you can imagine Abraham, Moses, and the great high priest going to the temple to sacrifice while reading the Old Covenant is about the most Jewish thing that ever did happen. But what's fascinating about the author's argument is he never disparages those things. He never speaks down about Moses or negatively about Abraham or knocks the temple. He thinks all of those things are wonderful and beautiful. But the fundamental argument he makes is that Christ is better than all of these things. The argument of the book of Hebrews is the superiority of Christ over all things. One of the really cool things about the book of Hebrews is it is not a letter. It is a sermon. Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to church this morning. We're so glad you're here. You are so welcome to join us today. My name's Patrick Stitt, and I'm really happy to see you. Until one of your children starts screaming during my sermon, then I'm going to give you a death stare right from the pit of hell. I'm looking at you because I can see what that child's going to be up to. The book of Hebrews is the dictation of a sermon most likely given to a Jewish Christian community living in Rome around the 50s AD. And as a sermon, it is filled with these wonderful rhetorical devices. The author of Hebrews was a very skilled orator. He would have been like the Stephen Furtick of his day. The dude brought the thunder. And he knew exactly how to preach and exactly how to preach well. In those days, your skill as a communicator was not designed by your ability to relate to people or to make sense to people or inspire people like it is today. Your skill as an orator was judged by your ability to use rhetorical devices. Rhetorical devices are linguistic and grammatical structures given within one's speech that would emphasize the text, bring a new layer of beauty and urgency and familiarity with the text. Fortunately, the book of Hebrews is absolutely full up of these wonderful rhetorical devices. So let's look at a few throughout the text. One rhetorical device is the rhetorical device of syncresis. Now, syncresis is the comparative juxtaposition of people and things. So at the beginning of your argument, you bring up two ideas and then you compare them through the text. And that is either to create a negative or positive allusion. And so what the author of Hebrews is, he uses the rhetorical device of syncresis and compares various elements that would be strongholds or areas of great devotion in Jewish culture and religion, and compares that with the person of Jesus Christ. This is particularly on display in Hebrews chapter 9, where the author compares the temple of Jerusalem with the heavenly temple established by Jesus Christ, and does this by putting together the attributes of the temple on one side of the chapter and the attributes of the heavenly temple on the other side of the chapter. In chapter 9, the author emphasizes that the Jerusalem temple is an earthly temple, whereas Christ's temple is a heavenly temple.
Now the first covenant had regulations for worship and also an earthly sanctuary. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence.
In verse 6, it emphasizes that the atonement given at the Jerusalem temple was a temporary atonement, whereas the heavenly atonement was a permanent atonement.
When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption.
In verse 12, the author emphasizes how animals are used in the Jerusalem temple, which are, unwilling, unspiritual, incapable of really being part of the redemptive process. Compare that with Christ's redemptive process, which he was a willing participant, a spiritual participant, a heavenly participant, with not just blood that had no sin, but blood that was infused with divine righteousness. There's this wonderful comparative juxtaposition where you look at the lamb that was slain, the earthly lamb that was slain, and the heavenly lamb that was slain.
How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God?
Another example of this would be in verse 10. It would talk about how you were cleansed externally in the flesh by the Jerusalem temple, but the heavenly temple cleansed your internal consciousness. And this is developed in the concept of relationship that comes through the Jeremiah covenant later on in the chapter. A fascinating character who comes up in the book of Hebrews is our good friend Melchizedek. Melchizedek is kind of an obscure character in the biblical world. He only appears twice in the Old Testament, once in Genesis and once in the book of Psalms. But in the first century, there's this really interesting cult that develops about Melchizedek, where he's seen as a messianic figure that's going to bring restoration through the priesthood and the political line of Israel in that day. The psalm reference to being a priest in the order of Melchizedek gives this wonderful comparison of what does it mean to be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Well, the author of Hebrews breaks it down for us. In verse 7, the author does another syncresis by comparing the Levitical priests of today to the Melchizedekan priesthood back in the day. Melchizedek is a fascinating character for three reasons. First, Melchizedek was both priest and king. Second, Melchizedek did not worship the God of the Bible. And finally, there was a first century cult around the person of Melchizedek. Number one, he is both a priest and a king. This was in no way unique in the ancient world. In fact, in most societies, people had both a religious and a political office. Nero was both Caesar and Son of God and great high priest. Muhammad was both a political and a spiritual leader. Where I live in Japan, Naruhito is considered to be a descendant of the god. He is both the emperor of Japan and he is the leader of the Shinto religion. In most societies, people have had both a religious and a spiritual office. We see something very similar in the Old Testament where Moses and the judges had both a spiritual and a political office. They were both lawgivers and prophets. Israel was quite unique in the ancient world in that they had both a political and a religious office. There was both a king and a priest. Another interesting element about Melchizedek is that he was probably not a follower of the God of Abraham. We don't know what God he followed, but it was probably his own form of idolatrous pagan religion in that day. Although uniquely, his name means King of Righteousness. The idea that he is King of Salem actually means could also mean King of Peace, and Salem's where we get the word Jerusalem. So there's an interesting connection in his name to the God of Abraham, or at least that train of thought, but for all we know, he probably was not in any meaningful sense a follower of the God of Abraham. The third interesting element about Melchizedek is in the first century, there was a bit of a cult of Melchizedek. First century Jewish theologian Philo wrote that Melchizedek is the logos of God, the same word John uses to describe Jesus, and said he is called a just king and the opposite of a tyrant. The Quran community, the same folks who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, also said that Elohim, who is often another name for God or a heavenly being, brings Melchizedek, who will save them from the hand of Belial or the devil. Melchizedek is also prophesied as coming on the final feast of Jubilee, which is also called the Day of Atonement. The famous book of 2nd Enoch is a massive fan of Melchizedek. There's a wonderful story about Melchizedek being born from a virgin's corpse, and he's fully formed, and he brings his dead mother back to life, and he's born as a priest, and then Gabriel takes him away to the Garden of Eden to survive the flood. The mythology of Melchizedek had developed over the millennia into this fascinating character that people looked up to even though we didn't really know much about him. So with this idea in mind, the author makes Christ a king in the order of Melchizedek and uses syncresis to compare those two ideas. The argument's kind of a fascinating one. You see, the Levites were the children of Abraham, and the idea is that they were basically contained within Abraham's person when he was alive. And since Abraham paid homage to Melchizedek, that must mean that the Levitical priests also paid homage to Melchizedek because they were contained in Abraham's person. In verse 17 and 20, the author notes that the Levitical priesthood is a temporary priesthood, but makes a very interesting argument that the Melchizedekan priesthood was eternal. In verses 26 to 27, it emphasizes that the Levitical priests were merely a religious office, but the Melchizedekan priesthood and kingship was both a religious and a political office, which is something that Christ came to fulfill. Finally, in verse 27, the Levitical priesthood is noted for being under the weakness of men, whereas the Melchizedekan priesthood is being perfected forever. Let's look at one more rhetorical device, because they are so magical. One of the most popular rhetorical devices we see in the book of Hebrews is what's called a midrash. A midrash is a section of the Bible that acts as a commentary on another section of the Bible. So we see in Hebrews chapter 8, it is a commentary on Jeremiah chapter 31. Jeremiah 31 promises a new covenant with God, but it's contained in a section of scripture from Jeremiah 29 to 32 that talks about a prior cleansing of God's people prior to an eschatological reality where God will be revealed in a brand new way. And it emphasizes this with, again, another syncresis where it compares the old covenant of the Old Testament with this new Jeremiah vision. In Hebrews 8 and 9, we see that the law is external, only making us look good on the outside. This is emphasized by things like dietary laws and circumcision and how one is dressed and things that make us look externally like we're very righteous. Compare this with Jeremiah 31 32 and 33, where it talks about the law being an internal process that doesn't just make us look good, but actually searches our hearts to see if there's things in there which do not please God and turns us to God. The next comparison, starting in Hebrews 8, 10, and 11, emphasizes that only one part of the entire world would ever know the reality of God. How the Old Covenant was focused on the nation of Israel, and even then, only a portion of the population of Israel ever truly followed God. Compare that with the Jeremiah vision in chapter 31, verses 33 and 34. This emphasizes that all people are going to know God, that there is a new covenant coming throughout all of the nations. And it's not just going to be where we know that have knowledge of God, but we'll know God intimately, that he will be within us and his covenant will be written on our hearts. Finally, compare that with the argument made in verse 12, where it emphasizes that the old covenant sacrifice was temporary. This is compared with Jeremiah 31 verse 34, where it talks about a permanent atonement for all people for all time. The author uses syncresis and midrash, these two beautiful rhetorical devices, to show the greatness of the new covenant that has come through Jesus, and compares it to the old covenant to just show how wonderfully, gloriously Christ is superior to all these things. Let's show how this is created by using another rhetorical device. The next rhetorical device is called a chiastic structure. This is where the author builds up to a center point by making a line of evidence, line of evidence, line of evidence, center point, and then creates a mirror-like structure where they revisit those same points of evidence to close up their speech. This is unique from modern audiences, where the point of the message is made at the beginning of a sermon or a presentation. Then at the center point, they give evidence to support their thesis, and then they close by reiterating the point that they were trying to make in the first place. Back in those days, they did the complete opposite thing. They presented evidence, made their point in the middle, and then kind of reviewed the evidence again. The author of Hebrews does this by using certain words to show how they're going back to their earlier points. We see words like if we disregard in chapter 2:3, but in 12:25, if we reject. We see both in the beginning and the end the concept of sonship. We see warning passages in Israel's lack of faith. And then we see a comparison of Jesus and Melchizedek and Jesus and salvation. And then the chief point is chapter 8. In fact, the author begins chapter 8 with the Greek word kephalion. This is a word related to the term for head, but fundamentally means the main point, the central idea. This is the author of Hebrews emphasizing that chapter 8 is the big idea in the book. Remember how we just went through chapter 8 and it is pointing to the Jeremiah covenant. Now, how do all the other points of talking about Moses and the temple and the priests and the king and the sacrifice, how did they all build up to be the main point that points to a Jeremiah covenant? Fundamentally, it all comes down to the concept of the atonement in the first century view. In the first century view of the atonement, it was a covenant between several parties. It wasn't just between God and I. Many people were involved in this process. So in order for them to be a new covenant, all of those members would have to be present to create that new covenant. Let me create a modern analogy. When I went to buy a house, several people had to be present. I had to be present to represent myself as the new buyer. The bank had to be present to make sure the finances were all accounted for. The realtor had to be present to represent that the transition of the home was done legally, and the previous owner had to be present to make sure they approved of the contract that was being given to them. Now imagine for a minute that I'm sitting in this meeting and I decide that I think the owner should give me half off the house, that the realtor shouldn't take any commission, and that the bank should just buy us all ice cream. The owner will say, I don't accept those terms. The realtor will say, that's illegal. The bank will say, that's my money, and the covenant will not be changed. In order for there to be a new covenant, all parties have to agree with the changes being made. But let's reimagine the scene. What if I'm the buyer, and I'm the bank, and I am the realtor, and I'm the previous owner? And I say, let's change the whole system so that we don't have any money, we don't have any different costs, and we all go get ice cream. Everyone will be in agreement because they're all the same person. In the covenant of the atonement, God is present in the temple, man is present through the priest, the sacrifice is present through the lamb, and the law is present through the king. All of these parties represent the different factors in the atonement. The covenant cannot be changed unless everyone agrees. In the new covenant of the atonement, God is represented by Jesus Christ. Man is represented by Jesus Christ. The perfect lamb, the sacrifice, is represented by Jesus Christ. The king, the priest and king in the order of Melchizedek, is represented by Jesus Christ. And he can bring about a new covenant. If he wants salvation to come to all nations, it comes to all nations. If he wants salvation to come through grace, it comes through grace. If he wants the law to be present in just loving one another, it happens because he is all members of the atonement, bringing forth a new covenant of the atonement. This is the fundamental point of Hebrews. Christ has come. He is superior to every part of the old covenant. He is superior to everything the world has to offer us. He fulfilled everything we could possibly imagine in the greatest and most glorious way. Anything we hold on to, be it religious or worldly, Christ offers us something superior, and that is the most glorious promise to which we can hold on to. So let's review what we've learned so far. The situation in Hebrews was likely caused by the political turmoil when Claudius expelled Jewish Christians from living in Rome when he was emperor. This likely caused tremendous persecution with the Jewish community living in Rome. The book of Hebrews is a sermon, and as a sermon it uses a tremendous amount of rhetorical devices. One in particular is synkrisis, where it compares a juxtaposition of two ideas. In particular, the author of Hebrews compares the Old Covenant with the New Covenant. He does this by showing that Christ is superior to several strongholds within the Jewish faith. This includes angels, Moses, Melchizedek, the sacrifice, the temple, and the great high priest. This comes to accumulation with the use of the rhetorical device of a chiastic structure, finally emphasizing that Christ has brought forth a new covenant by being all members of the atonement present in one. Thank you for joining us on this study of the book of Hebrews. If you'd like more information, please feel free to check out our verse-by-verse Bible study of the entire book of Hebrews right here. May God bless you and all the promises of Christ spoken of in the book of Hebrews be with you all. Amen and amen.